Hi, everybody. This is David Marler from Rotterdam, UAS, and this is the web lecture on British political life for the course Culture and Literature 2, British Culture and Literature. Now, the objectives for this course are the following. The student can describe what the most important political parties stand for. They can name the events that led to the Brexit, and they can explain what British attitude is towards politics and towards Europe. And today we're going to talk about British political life, attitudes towards politics, the most important political parties and their policies, and we're going to talk about Euroscepticism and Brexit. Now, we're going to start this lecture off by talking about the public's attitude towards politics. In general, the public is quite suspicious of politics in the United Kingdom. The public does not expect that any politician would do anything illegal, but most people in Britain do not believe that politicians are truthful. On the contrary, most people believe that politicians lie on a regular basis. This is because Britons are normally quite suspicious of politics and politicians. As was noted in your textbook, the lack of enthusiasm for politicians is reflected in the general ignorance of who they are. Less than half of the adults in Britain know the name of their local MP or Member of Parliament. In Britain, most people have accepted that politics is a dirty business and a necessary evil. At the same time, Britain has a deep respect for the rule of law. There's a kind of contradictory duality to the way that British people view the law. Britons in general have a high respect for the rule of law, but on the other hand, people in Britain often oppose making new laws. Culturally, we can see that Great Britain as a country and the people who have a greater respect for law. At the same time, we can see that many of the rules and regulations that exist in the rest of the world are absent in Britain today. Examples of these different types of laws, or the lack thereof in Britain, can be seen, for instance, with British ID cards. Britain is one of the few countries in the Western world that does not require anyone to have any form of identification. So if you're a Briton who does not drive a car, or who has not traveled abroad, you do not have an ID card. This means that there's a substantial part of the population that has no form of identification. Likewise, the Freedom of Information Act was passed only a few years ago, and the act that was placed is much more restrictive than similar laws in other developed countries. There are also secrecy laws in the UK that force civil servants not to discuss or divulge their work for the government, sometimes even for civil servants that don't do that important work. When the government discusses the idea of adding a national ID law like they have in the past, it's not long until certain political parties ensure that these laws are revoked. That's why the old national ID card that the Brits did have only lasted for about a year. Now that brings us to the first question that you're going to prepare for your class, and that is, what type of government does Britain have? You can find this on page 73, 74, and for instance, we're talking about, a federal democracy, monarchy, etc. The second question that I want you to look up is on page 73, features of the British system of government that are different from other countries that we've discussed. What are they? Now, in order to understand how Britain works, we have to understand how the Parliament works, and more specifically, a system of pairing. So the British House of Commons is actually quite a large governing body, but you won't always see everyone there that's supposed to be there, and that's because of pairing. The pairing system is an excellent example of how the habit of political cooperation among political parties in Britain has been carried on. Under this system, an MP of one party is paired with an MP of another party, and when there's going to be a vote in House of Commons. For instance, one MP from Labour who's going to vote against a rule, and one MP from the Tories or the Conservatives who are going to vote for a rule, both decide, hey, we're just going to cancel each other out, so we're not going to show up to the vote. As you can see in the image above, the UK is mainly ruled by a two-party system, even though, as you can see, there are other parties, meaning that it is not unusual for the cabinet or government to consist of one party with 50% of the rule. And this is quite special actually in Europe, where coalitions are much more important. Now, coalitions have become important in the past decade, but most of the 20th century was an era without coalitions. So if the Labour Party had control, they had total control. Likewise, the Conservative Party had control, they had total control. The reason why this system exists has to do with the two main aspects of the British political system that will be covered in later weeks, namely the constituency system and the first past the post voting system. And we're going to have a quick look at the political parties in the UK. The first one that we're going to look at is the largest party right now, that's the Conservative Party, but you'll often hear them being called the Tories. Now, the Tories became known as the Conservatives in the 1830s, and they have an emphasis on personal, social, and economic freedom, the individual ownership of property. They're very much a law and order party, and they're very conservative in the fact that they want to keep the status quo. So ideas about the monarchy, etc., are often stronger amongst people that are conservatives. The second largest party that you have is the Labour Party, which was created in 1906 to support the trade unions. Traditionally, their emphasis is on social justice, equality of opportunity, and they believe in state ownership of industries and services, for instance, the coal industry in the 1970s and 80s. And in the 1990s, you had a new movement called New Labour, which was a movement towards the center under Tony Blair. The third largest party that you'll have is the Liberal Democrats, which was actually formed in the 1980s as a union between the Liberals, which used to be called the Whigs Party back in the 19th and early 20th century, and the Social Democrats, which was a breakaway group of labor politicians who supported the European Union. At the time in the 1970s, there was actually a referendum to see whether the UK was going to stay in the European Union, officially join it, 2 years after they had joined it. And this caused a rupture in the Labour Party. And so you had the Social Democrats, and they then mixed with the Liberal Party. Now, they're regarded as center of left, and they're in favor of greater unification with the EU, more emphasis on the environment, and they want to reform the election system. Traditionally, people from all classes vote for them, but it's much more people in the middle class. Now, the third question you have to prepare is research what Plaid Cymru and the Scottish National Party, or the SNP, are, and what makes them different from Labour, the Conservatives, and the Lib Dems. Now, the next part that you need to know when we're talking about this is what different aspects are when we're talking about political life. There's an actual quite strange institution that exists in the UK that a lot of countries don't have, and that's called the Shadow Cabinet. Now, the Shadow Cabinet, or the Shadow Ministry, is a feature of Westminster system of government. It consists of a senior group of opposition spokespeople who, under the leader of the opposition, form an alternative cabinet. Each person that's part of the Shadow Cabinet essentially has no power, but they're made to be there just to step in case the opposition gets the majority. But they're also there to critique and kind of keep an eye on each of the ministries. The front bench, as you can see here, these are the people who sit closest to the Speaker in the House of Commons, and these are the people that generally in the opposition or in the government have the largest amount of power. Now we're going to move on and start talking about the Brexit. And I want to take you back to in European time on the 1st of February 2020, but of course in the UK it would be on the 31st of January 2020. And then at midnight in European time on 1 February 2020, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland left the European Union. But the story of how this happened occurred more than 50 years ago, back in 1963. For a matter of fact, before the outbreak of the coronavirus in Europe in March of 2020, the Brexit dominated the news in both the UK and Europe. It's important for us to understand how the political institutions of the United Kingdom and of the European Union led to the Brexit referendum in 2016. So in order for us to start, we have to go back to the establishment of the European Economic Community in 1957 on March 25th. This is generally referred to as the Common Market in the UK, and it's on this date, March 25th, 1957, we can see that several steps were taken towards closer fiscal and political harmony, and this would eventually result in the European Union. So France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg signed a treaty establishing the European Economic Community. This began with an integration of French and German coal and the steel industries in the early 1950s. Italy and the Benelux countries soon joined the affiliation. Now, the UK immediately wanted to join this, but they saw that there were going to be large issues. In 1963 and 1967, Britain tried to join the EEC, the European Economic Community, but it was vetoed both times by France. Charles de Gaulle, president of the French Republic, was afraid of the relationship that the UK had with the United States, something that we'll later refer to as the special relationship. He was afraid that the USA would gain too much power in Europe through the UK. The UK, in his opinion, was too different from the rest of the European Unions. This was frustrating for Brits who viewed membership as being economically important for the future of their country, and especially Brits in the Conservative Party. One of those was Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher disagreed with Charles de Gaulle vehemently, and she wrote a famous speech called the Half-Right Speech, in which she said it was Britain's long history of continuous constitutional development, the respect in which her institutions were held, the honesty of her politicians, and the integrity of her judges, the fact that not since the Norman conquest had she known occupation, and that neither Nazism nor communism had ever gained grip on her political life. All these things marked Britain out from continental Europe. According to Thatcher, the fact that Britain was different from continental Europe made it a better candidate for the EEC. Britain, in her eyes, was stable and it could be trusted. And so she said that the general is half right. Britain is different, and that's why Britain is still repeatedly at odds with other European countries. However, determinedly cooperative British politicians wish to be. And eventually, Thatcher and the UK got its way, and in 1973, they joined the EEC. But they almost back out 2 years later in 1975 when a referendum is held. But 67% of Brits vote to join the EEC, which later became the EU. But immediately after joining, within a decade, there were already issues. In 1984, the UK was the third poorest member of the European Union, but was one of the largest payers. This had to do with the fact that a majority of the money that a country got came through farm subsidies, and that the UK is actually not one of the largest farming nations in the European Union. Then in 1993, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, and under that treaty, the European Union became an official organization with laws, etc. And in the 2000s, we have that there's northward and eastward expansion in the European Union, which means that it's becoming larger and larger. Now, this caused a lot of problems for, kind of funny aspects of British life that seemed quite unfair at the time. And one of those has to deal with this is chocolate. So chocolate is a great example of the tensions between Europe and the United Kingdom. Now, as Sarah Pruitt noted, in 2000, after a 27-year-long battle and a victorious verdict from the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, British chocolate could finally be sold in the rest of Europe. A lot of people in France, Belgium, and Spain and Italy, among other nations, had argued that only cocoa butter and not vegetable oil should be used when making chocolate. They also thought that British-made chocolate, including popular brands like Mars bars, Kit Kat, Cadbury's, had far too much milk, and said that it could only be sold if it was labeled as household milk chocolate, milk substitute, or even Vegelit. Now, a lot of British people who already had problems with over-regulation saw these laws as being arbitrary and disproportionately and negatively affecting British companies. But another aspect that was really difficult for a lot of British people to swallow was the border. As you'll read in the Will Oliver article, from 2004 until 2007, the EU expanded to encompass former communist states like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Now, when the Labour government said at the time that there was going to be around 5,000 to 13,000 people that would arrive in the first year, and that was a reason why the UK should not impose temporary travel restrictions on migrants like the Netherlands did. If you remember at this time, the Netherlands said that for the first 2 to 3 years, depending on the country, the people, for instance, from Poland, etc., would not be able to move to the Netherlands, and if they wanted to, they'd have to have a work permit. And this was allowed by EU law. The UK at the time said, though, no, we're not going to do that. There's only going to be a few thousand people that came. But in fact, within the first 2 years, 2004, 2005, 129,000 people entered the UK. Now, this is, of course, logical because a lot of people in these countries had been learning English, and it would make a lot of sense for them to go to a country like the UK. So, this led over a long period of time for the British people to kind of become tired of the European Union. And in 2015, David Cameron was running for re-election with the Conservative Party, and one of his promises to the British people was that they would get a referendum on European Union membership if the Conservatives won a majority of the vote and did not have to form a coalition government. In 2015, he won, and David Cameron went to the European Union to renegotiate the UK's relationship with the EU. This was going to be an issue for the other EU members. Margaret Thatcher had already organized a 20% reduction in funding towards the EU, which still existed until the UK left the Union. The United Kingdom also had exemptions on the euro and economic laws, their borders, for instance. Along with Ireland, the UK has its own border system, and also exemptions under Protocol 36 of the Lisbon Treaty, which said that the UK had the option to opt out of all police and criminal justice legislation adopted prior to the treaty's entrance into force. All European leaders were not quite sure if the EU should allow the UK to even have more opt-outs, meaning that the UK was essentially becoming a country that followed very few of the EU laws. At the same time, we see popular politicians becoming more popular, like Nigel Farage with his United Kingdom Independence Party, also known as UKIP. He had very little to no power in the UK Parliament, which runs on the first past the post and constituency model, but European Union elections allowed him to have more seats and a podium for his anti-European sentiments. Still, too many people in the UK on the right saw Farage as being too extreme and too xenophobic. Then there's Boris Johnson, who comes into play. There are reports that on the day that Boris Johnson chose to support the Brexit, that he had written 2 speeches. One speech was to propose staying in the EU, and another was to leave. Too many in the UK, Boris Johnson is a political opportunist. He upset a lot of people with certain campaign rhetoric that ended up being not true. An example of this can be seen on the bus in the picture, which says that the UK sends £350 million to the EU per week. And he promised time and time again to use that money to fund the National Health Service, a promise which he has not kept. This all led to the referendum on the 23rd of June 2016. At the time, a lot of people believed sincerely that Leave would not win, but they did. People in the north of England and Wales, and a lot of the cities outside of London, voted to leave. This came as a shock to the political apparatus in London that was sure that many Labour constituents would vote to remain. But in the end, 51.89% voted to leave, and 48.1% voted to remain. Now, the next question that you have is going to be what the backstop is and why it was important with Ireland and for Brexit negotiations. This is the end of this small web lecture. You'll have to come to class with the 4 questions prepared. Thanks.